Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to distinguish between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. Of course, with any disorder, there generally tends to be an overlap between or commonality between each disorder and the disorder itself. However, how close we are to the truth or defining it or reaching a conclusion is proportional to the boundary itself and what is fed within the boundary and how loose, how strongly attached the evidence is, or in terms of, you know, which is predicated on scientific understanding. And over time, if a disorder is initially born, it's very hard to diagnose it. It's very hard to understand. Sometimes they we dispose of these disorders later on and we maybe or construct new disorders that are more fitting or more precise. So really, it's just, even though like this is why when you try to diagnose, it's not going to be 100% conclusive, because it's always evolving, it's always changing. But I'm going to do my best to the best of my ability. I'm going to try to present it such a way that to link or to focus on the causation of the illness itself rather than just the facts, rather than just specifics. Because in order to be very conclusive or definitive or find a definitive answer, there needs to be a deeper understanding. And without that, it's just because of the degree of overlap, it's very hard to build that. Because if we attach ourselves to these specific symptoms, it's going to be projected in multiple different directions because a lot of other illnesses potentially have those same um, symptoms. So, in terms of borderline, what I believe, or not what I believe, it's basically based on the information I've collected. It starts with trauma, a traumatic experience, which is generally connected to interpersonal problems within the family, or neglection, or abuse in some form. Because our identity itself, personality, is grows, and it really stagnates once you reach adulthood. Your personality always evolves, but the core traits that you exhibit stay relatively static. I'm not, of course, there's some change, but think of it like the transformation of a function. When you're growing at a such fast rate, and the frequency is increasing, and your brain is exploding with energy, entropy, you're basically, how will I put it? Your mind is working at such high capacity during your growth phase, and during this phase, especially when you're young, you generally have more curiosity, more drive, more energy, because your organ system, everything's working at such high capacity, but it starts to slow down over time. But that's not the main reason. It's just that drive to soak in as much information as possible to predicate survival. And therefore, everything that we're soaking is dictating our personality, the core traits that are there. And these core traits is what really causes the problems with borderline personality disorder, because you want your core traits to be positive. You don't want your core traits to be, negative. And what I mean by that is, so, with abuse or neglection, you can develop these, basically based on your experiences, the thoughts that get projected into your mind, or the thoughts that you hold on to, kind of it affects your subconscious. And anytime we have, in terms of our subconscious, it affects our dreams. And then even that affects, just how we go about perceiving reality in the world. So when these core traits are pulled in the negative direction, meaning like you have low self-esteem, you dislike yourself, you beat yourself up, or you're very sensitive to criticism. This is based there because it's like I like to think of it like ADHD. ADHD is a problem with regulating impulse control, and the reason for this is people with ADHD do not get a typical reward for menial tasks or tasks that neurotypicals or people who are closer to the neutral axis and don't experience the neurochemical issues um, from ADHD. What ends up happening is, neurotypicals get a yield. They yield a normal reward. Normality doesn't really exist, but what it what it means is that you're essentially closer to a typical reward that is spread over a larger scale of the population. Because in general, people with ADHD, it's pretty rare. It's more towards the outlier. And when you're an outlier in terms of neurochemical development, what ends up happening with the reward signaling is it's dampened for a typical tasks like cleaning or you know um, doing repetitive tasks. It for someone with ADHD, it's like depression. Think of it that way. You don't get the feedback. Therefore, if you stay in that mode for too long, you get depressed. It sucks you down because you're not getting any positive reinforcement. So what do? They essentially go towards video games or any activity that stimulates them to such high capacity because they need more stimulation to yield a reward that is typical of a neurotypical or typical to get them back to that baseline. And in order to do that, they have to overcompensate. So same with borderline. But in this case, what ends up happening is they need that positive reinforcement for their identity. So their identity is being repressed because a traumatic experience has led them to their mind to be directed toward tends to go in the negative direction more frequently depending on external factors and influence. And this sabotages the identity. It basically causes such a of of dampening of the identity, or kind of causes it to collapse to zero, like complete emptiness. So that in order to compensate and actually get yourself back up, you need to overemphasize, and therefore you need more reaffirmation or affirmation, more. You could put compliments or some basically some success. In generally, it has to be within a personal relationship. The expectations tend to increase because if someone didn't get a lot of, if they were neglected, they need, they basically have such a need to get that, to fill that void. And it's such a higher expectation than typical because they don't derive that satisfaction at the same level. It takes so much more. And their expectation because so high, they may not a lot of times meet it. And most people don't even meet this. And that's what's always going to cause the drag down, because when the expectation actually keeps going up, and this is predicated based on how bad the trauma is. And I think it's probably proportional to that. So therefore, if there's more neglection, it's going to cause the bar to raise higher, and therefore that's going to cause recovery to be slower because you're going to continue to go through this cyclic process of beating, and it's going to happen tends to happen frequently because in actuality the world is chaotic. We can't predict. People are all over the place, and you know in this world, we're trying to feed ourselves. Everyone's trying to feed their identity in some form. So that's why, like, with borderline is they need that affirmation, but it's not a lot of times not going to be met, and especially in a lot of environments. If someone with borderline goes random directions and over the place, and they go in the wrong environments or domains, it's going to cause more havoc and instability and volatility. So the key to problem with or borderline, in order to try to mitigate, is find a niche to build recovery, immerse. The key is to uh, try to. It's really trying to gain self awareness, because, and that's very difficult to do with someone who's borderline because they're very externally focused on receiving that input. And a lot of times, like, we tend to associate BPD with, like, on overlapping with narcissism and all this. But the real reality is, it's these disorders are very convoluted, and they're loose. A lot of times could be very loosely defined, and depending on who you talk to, and we don't have a full understanding. But Borderline, the big distinction is where it originates. So generally, someone borderline, of course, the frequency of moods tends to be more higher relative to bipolar. It happens at a much more higher frequency because it's connected to the external world. So the best way to distinguish between borderline and bipolar is you if you remove, imagine yourself in a void. Everything is eliminated. All people are gone. You well, this is probably a bad instance because people with borderline tend to be quite lonely. So there's a spectrum. You could be a quiet borderline or someone who needs relationships all the time to feed it. But you could think of, yeah, this example could work because if you take away the external feedback that you need, if you take away, like, say, the people out of the equation, and some people with borderline, they tend to be more on the avoidance scale or avoidance side. So it may not affect them as much. It actually may minimize the mood. This is kind of interesting, and the only reason for that is because people cause their volatility. So therefore, if you eliminate it, and they aren't really need that interpersonal relationships, which is generally with a quiet borderline, you end up finding that they are more content, or they don't have the swings as frequent, or it's not as frequent. But someone else who needs relationships, they're going to be very lonely, and probably their moods can oscillate and go very in a negative direction very quick. And that's a good way to indicate, if you take away the external influence, the volatility, either it can increase, but also could it could also be suppressed depending on which direction the borderline, or which direction you go, because there are some commonalities between avoidant personality and borderline. There's some borderlines who are denoted as quiet borderlines who actually kind of give up on, or they find a way to repress. I think it's more of a repression to survive. They repress the volatility because it helps stabilize the nervous system, and usually this case is through internalizing. Introversion is what leads to this. Someone who always needs relationships is very much an extrovert. Who needs people all the time is an extrovert. So people with that extroversion or high extroversion are not going to internalize as much. They can still internalize, but it'll be harder because their whole focal point is on people. So they have to go out and basically feed the neglect. Generally, I would think it probably tied to more of the neglection. They were more neglected, so they need love. They continually need affirmation of love, or or someone who meets that criteria that they uh, basically, it's kind of like a distortion of the reality of what they view as a loving relationship, because the reason it's distorted the, is based on the initial points. When there has been severe neglection, they they don't derive. They feel empty, and when you feel, I guess, empty, you need to fill that cup, and it's much harder to do so. So you have to go to the other extreme to try to fill it, and that's why going to the other extreme creates kind of a distortion, and therefore that's why it's like you have the black and white type of mode, and generally a borderline, it's either a lot of times like they love you or they hate you. So that's a big distinction between borderline, is they don't have much of a neutral zone. They go up and down, and it's extreme one extreme or the other, and it happens also very frequently. It's, you can of course potentially have both bipolar and borderline, but in terms of bipolar, if you took away all the external influence, the mood swings are still going to follow a pattern. In fact, with bipolar, you can actually be connected to the cycle. You know it's coming. If you actually become attuned to it, like when you meditate, you can actually, and a lot of times with bipolar, is a progression is, it's not like immediate. It's not like an off or on switch or a flick of the switch where your mood swings. That's generally borderline. Borderline mood swings happen very fast, but with bipolar, it's like a ramp. And the hardest part about, you know, distinguishing between borderline and bipolar is a lot of times in bipolar, when you go towards depression, you can take a lot of the characteristics of someone with BPD because your self esteem starts going in. You basically take on an identity. Your identity in depression is different than your identity in mania. It takes on a different form, and a lot of the thoughts recur. These thoughts that come back during depression because it's predicated on you know essentially how you feel. So a lot of times with bipolar, it's more so connected to the internal world, how you know basically it's all the mood swings are going to be connected to the biological change. The You feel like you may feel horrible, tired, lethargic, brain dead. Your mind is just sapped with no energy. You lose motivation. You lose your creativity, and that reinforces the depression. And potentially your self-esteem could take a dip, and you may even be more volatile in terms of external factor or in terms of like the external world and how it affects you, because when you feel internally you feel horrible, you could lash out. And so all the characteristics could you know take overlap with bipolar and borderline, especially when someone who has bipolar is in a depressive or mixed episode, because a mixed episode is very confusing. In fact, the mixed episode tends to be uh, like on a tends to be a combination of manic or hypermanic, hypomanic uh, behavior in combination with adrenaline surges, or your stress hormones are ramping up very high. So you're having a confusion. Your neurochemicals are are basically all over the place, like scattered and offset and imbalanced, and it's creating chaos. And essentially, with a mixed episode, you may get quite a few frequent changes in your mood and oscillations. So that can definitely be an overlap. But the biggest difference is with bipolar, it doesn't need the external triggers. I mean, external triggers like seasonal changes or a death of a loved one can trigger an episode of bipolar, but it tends not to be attached to the impersonal relationships. And the reason this is a big distinction that is probably the best way to arguably um, make a definitive or conclusive distinction between bipolar and borderline is through uh, interpersonal or connection to the interpersonal world and how it influences the mood, because it's because borderline is based on uh, emptiness in terms of the identity, and in order to feed it you need something that was lacking. And what was lacking, if someone neglects you or traumatizes you or causes abuse, you know you're it reinforces that hatred of yourself. You basically are treated like dirt. You're treated like you're not worthwhile to live in this world. And so therefore, to feed that, they need affirmation in some form. And the person who created the abuse or the neglect uh, basically triggered it. But to reaffirm that, it it's you need generally someone borderline needs something to boost their confidence. And the social realm, the social world is has major influence on confidence and identity. So therefore, that's why people with borderline have a large it's like their focal point is on the social world and how to feed it. Whereas bipolar doesn't really need it. They may not necessarily need it. In depression, they may not want to talk to anyone for months, and they don't want to. Usually don't do that because they don't want people to. Uh, they just are sabotaged by the identity they have currently that has been sapped of energy and is dull and not able to uh, not able to invoke an enthusiasm like they once were during a manic episode. During mania, they want everyone to, be, happier, have the energy, and have, they. That's why people in mania can be giving, or they give away a lot of money, or they want to. They just are very optimistic, and of course impulsive as well. But it's all connected to the biological changes in the cycle. So if the cycle is very smooth and it's not volatile, that points towards bipolar. Of course, if there's overlap, you're gonna have more volatility, but you're gonna have it's gonna be out of sync. You're gonna have this like oscillation, a smooth cycle, but you're also going to have the volatility of BPD. So BPD is like penny stocks. It's very unpredictable. It's all over the place. The mood swings go up, down. It's scattered in multiple different directions. So think volatility connecting to BPD and smoothness connecting to bipolar. How smooth is the cycle? Can you actually feel it ramping up? Can you determine that it's slowly you're getting your motivation, but it's slowly moving up? Because what I've learned in bipolar, anytime your neurochemicals change, that doesn't signify an immediate change. It's not like you wake up and you're manic or you wake up you're happy. It could take weeks before you feel the effects of increased chemicals. And even then, it usually ramps up in a cyclic pattern. So your neurochemical, like the changes you're going to experience, is proportional to the cyclic change in your neurochemical balance. But of course, in some probably very rare cases, the transition periods are much faster, so you oscillate faster in bipolar swings. But it's always going to be connected to the internal chemistry. And so if you can, like when you meditate, you're connected to your internal world. If you find that you can actually be more attuned to it, it's going to be easier to figure out whether it's bipolar or BPD, because BPD starts from the external world. It comes in, creates that nervous system reaction, and that feels the change in potential chemical, causes it's like you're building up a ton of potential energy, and it becomes kinetic, and you lash out at the world, or you may lash out at yourself, and that energy that's created is proportional to the external effect. What BPD bipolar, starts with the internal and then it goes outward. So the direction from internal to outward versus external to internal to create the mood changes. And that's just the way I view it, um, based on my experiences, listening to other people talk about it. And of course, it's also limiting because I'm not an expert in this area. I just have my own worldview, and I just hope this kind of helped make it more clear about regarding the distinction between bipolar and borderline. And that's all I have right now. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.